Hello, welcome to the Third Party Therapy Podcast. Today I'm joined by Charlie Jones from Reversing Labs, looking at a new approach to assessing the software that we buy called static binary analysis, opening up the software packages to understand what's in there, where does it come from, and what risks does it pose. I hope you enjoy the conversation. So Charlie, thank you very much for joining us on the Third Party Therapy Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Very excited to dive into one of my favorite topics.
Well, let's get going then. So you've been around the topic of third-party cybersecurity for quite some time, both in your current role and previous roles as well. Could you just give us a flavour of how you started out in this journey and what some of the challenges you've seen as you've moved forward as well?
Sure. So currently, I am a director of product management at a company called Reversing Labs, and I specifically oversee our software supply chain security product. But previously to Reversing Labs and this focus on software, I led the supply chain security proposition at PwC in the UK. And I'd say that's where my kind of passion for the domain of third-party risk was born. I was lucky enough early in my career to get placed in what we call this kind of like boots on the ground assessor role for a Fortune 100 bank. And every week we'd hit the road, we'd perform a cybersecurity assessment of a third party. At the end of the week, you head home, you write up the report, and you do it all over again. So it's a great experience and really, honestly, an amazing way to learn how the supply chain of a global financial service institution works, right? You get to see the unique security risks that are presented by this massive range of supplier types, from business process outsourcers to cloud service providers to data centers, or even these non-traditional third-party types like international subsidiaries or strategic alliances in a bank that looks like card partnerships, right? So I got this amazing exposure to a broad range of businesses all in a very small period of time. And then obviously, as your kind of career progresses, you move away from doing the grunt work. So you lead the teams that do assessments and build larger programs and operational models to oversee third parties. But it really wasn't until the end of 2021, I'd say, so a couple of years ago now, where we started noticing this uptick of attacks while we were supporting our clients in one very specific supplier type, which was software vendors. So between the classics, right, the CodeCov, the SolarWinds, the Kaseya, and so on. So it ultimately led me to realize personally that commercial off-the-shelf software vendors fell out of scope of these traditional kind of third-party risk programs, most of which would only evaluate vendors either on vendors they share data with or vendors they provide connectivity into their network, neither of which apply to a commercial software vendor, of course. So as we went down this rabbit hole of kind of advising customers how to modify their programs to oversee this third-party type and this new risk that's emerging in software, I came to this across this very unique approach to software supply chain security called static binary analysis, which essentially allows you to test a third-party commercial software package before you procure it, before you deploy it. And I came across Reversing Labs as essentially one of the only organizations that can help do this with a high degree of certainty, considering risks and threats. So here I am now kind of in my career trying to raise awareness for what I'll call a technology, but more so a methodology and approach to overseeing commercial software vendors that frankly not a lot of people are aware of even being an option right now.
Absolutely. And we will definitely come on to that one in a minute because it's a very interesting topic. And I guess whilst you saw that evolution go through, I think that is still a very relevant challenge to TPRM organizations, in that your commoditized off-the-shelf software are things that you as an organization, you either buy or you don't. That it's not it's half the time not even one that you negotiate on license. You might buy it through a reseller. You might, it's part of your infrastructure. It's not going to be your top level CRM solution, your trading platform, anything like that. That's going to have, bespoke development, a project around it and everything like that. This is going to be the seemingly low level transactional purchases that allow these things. And if you look at things like MoveIt and CrowdStrike and things like that are coming into organizations, and the challenges that they're coming into the organization, that's exactly where these products sit. These are ones that fly under the radar, aren't they?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's definitely a problem of first, just like the classic TPRM problem of not knowing who your vendors are. You have the same problem in the software supply chain, not knowing what software the business is consuming. So just like you need a third party register and third party risk management, you need a software catalog to
Yeah.
understand what you're consuming and what the risk plays. But you mentioned kind of like evolution, and before we even get into the software supply chain, I think we're seeing this kind of seismic shift in the way that third party risk is more generally being managed. And I think personally, a lot of it, I've had personal exposure to this, is that a lot of it stems from these kind of like dwindling levels of assurance that you can get from a questionnaire, which for the longest time have been this industry standard approach for vendor oversight. I've done them myself, like I said, for years at a time. I was just doing questionnaire based assessments over and over and over again. But in reality, when you step back and look at that, there's a bit of a flaw in that process because you're entirely reliant on your vendor to provide this truthful and accurate representation on how secure they are based on what they tell you.
Hmm.
Um, the other issue with questionnaires when we get more into the supply chain and software supply chain is they don't scale very well to this very diverse third party ecosystem that we talked about, all these different suppliers that you may interact with and rely on to run your business,
Hmm.
because questionnaires are so uniform. So it's very hard to take into consideration risks that are presented by all these different third party types. And I think software vendors were that first third party type to really break the mold and demonstrate that you can't govern all of your vendors in the same way. There was this very eye opening quote for me from a recent Gartner survey that essentially said 83% of cyber risk professionals find risks embedded in vendor software applications after they deploy it. So it just shows that whatever preventative controls that we're trying to enforce as an industry on software to protect ourselves as enterprises clearly aren't working. When 8 and 10 software products that you're procuring, you're finding risks that you didn't even know about during the procurement process. So I think that's forcing us to rethink approach, moving away from this kind of one size fits all approach towards a method of evaluation and assurance that's based on the actual products and services that you're consuming. So in software, that's the actual binary software package that you're going to buy, put in your environment, connect to other pieces of technology and start pumping data through.
Absolutely. And I guess this is where you have that um, difference between assessing the controls of the supplier and actually assessing the effective the controls of the piece of software that you're actually buying, which you're going to be import. Um, Before we sort of dive into the actual approach that you're sort of uh, talking about here, is what we're talking about here focused primarily on on-prem software, or does it scale to SaaS as well, which is also obviously a challenge we have to face?
Yeah, it's a mix, right? So the what we're talking about, static binary analysis, this technology that allows you visibility into the software you procure. The limitation is you need the software itself, right? You need the binary. So it's a commercial off the shelf product that you're hosting internally. Um, Certainly, a lot of the software, more and more software that you consume is SaaS. Um, and that SaaS software is just deployed in containers that are
Hmm.
hosted within the vendor environment. So there will still always be this two-pronged approach, right? Getting comfort over your vendor environment and the risk profile. So if they're performing a or providing a SaaS service for you, that may be all the traditional questionnaires that you're performing, plus visibility into the software development lifecycle and specifically the containerized applications which they host and provide you, but also then getting comfort over the products or services that you consume if that product comes out of their environment and
Got it.
into your environment. So, like a lot of people ask, like, oh, is this going to replace our existing due diligence processes? Should we just throw all our tools out the window? I'm definitely in no way advocating for that. There's always going to be this due diligence and assessment effort that look at things that are generic to a vendor, right?
Hmm.
Anti-money laundering risk, anti-bribery risk, reputational risk, geopolitical risk, financial viability risk, right? The risk that a vendor becomes insolvent and can no longer provide services to you. Those are focused on the vendor. yes, to your point, also, if they're providing a SaaS service, you may also want to inspect or get visibility into how they're protecting the development of those application containers in their environment too. The second prong of that is the tailored due diligence based on supplier type. So yes, for software vendors, that may be looking at the software. There's other vendor types as well. Maybe they're providing a uh, air gapped card production facility where um, the process that you're going to perform to do due diligence over them shouldn't be the same as a software vendor. Maybe you're doing um, air assessments of their network security and their ability to air gap networks properly. So it all depends on that product and that service. And that's not just me saying this. There are almost every legal, regulatory, mandatory framework out there is now coming out and saying that you need to have a product and service focused view. So
Absolutely.
PCI DSS, NCSC in the UK has guidance on doing this. NIST CSF 2.0, the new publication of NIST cybersecurity framework, says something very similar. So yeah, we're definitely seeing this shift in not only looking at the vendor environment, which is traditional TPRM, in my opinion, but looking at the product and service that falls out of that environment as well.
Absolutely. And I think, and as we go into this, it's quite clear that this is where TPRM teams need to partner very closely with the technology teams, cybersecurity teams, technology resilience teams to, yeah, it's almost no good just looking at the supplier and not looking at the product, or looking at the product, not looking at the supplier. These two things need to mesh together, definitely.
Yeah. I, that's interesting that you said that. Software supply chain security is like this one kind of emerging domain that we see that it doesn't really fit within a neat box of like one organizational group. Like you said, you kind of need to cross-functionally align with other teams in your business to like truly get value out of what you're trying to do. There are some organizations that have like these very mature capabilities, and they'll have like a software supply chain security team, but that's kind of few and far between. So traditionally, we see this function falling across different business units. Definitely.
Mhm. Okay, so let's dive into it a bit more. So, can you, bearing in mind that I and hopefully many of our listeners are general TPRM people, we're not cyber security experts, although we do have a number of cyber people out there. Can you just explain what this approach actually is? What is the approach? What makes it different to some of the more traditional testing that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah. So I'd say the one thing about traditional testing methods, so software supply chain threat is not new, obviously. People have been consuming software for many years. Um, that being said, a lot of the techniques that are being used, old legacy kind of security products weren't designed to address them, right? You have things like a lot of times people will point to a compensating control of antivirus or anti-malware. In almost every single security questionnaire that I've seen, that you ask a vendor, they're like, oh, do we have this in place? No. Oh, well, we have antivirus or anti-malware. So even if this software that we buy somehow gets tainted or has a critical severity vulnerability in it, we have some scanning solution in our environment that will pick it up. Well, those legacy tool sets weren't designed with the modern application in mind that is incredibly large, incredibly complex. So a lot of them were designed to identify threats in like single files. So you download an email attachment or you download a file or an application off, I don't know, a cloud storage solution and download that to your laptop, your endpoint. They're hundreds of megabytes in size. You can scan them very quickly, see if there's threats in them. The modern application is extremely bloated. It's grown over time. So I was just downloading, because I got a new laptop the other day. I was downloading uh, Microsoft Word, not even the entire Office suite. And Microsoft Word alone was north of 2 gigabytes. These legacy security scanning solutions that you may rely on for downstream compensating control for software that you're buying don't scan anything larger than 100 megabytes in
Mhm.
size. So software applications, the scale that they've grown to, traditional tools just aren't equipped to determine whether they present a risk to your business because they just get bypassed. And malicious actors know that specifically. So when I actually worked in red teams, ethical hacking teams, if a ethical hacking team wanted to breach a financial service organization, the first thing they would do is just artificially bloat a package. So they'd put some huge file into it, knowing that it would bypass almost any single security tool in it because it was too large to be scanned. So that's the first thing that's unique about our solution and the this approach um, to commercial software oversight is you need a solution that can scan very, very large digital objects because commercial software packages and containers can be tens, 20, 30 gigabytes in size. So what it does is it takes that package, that very large, complex package, and it essentially rips it into shreds. It deconstructs it and looks at all the parts that make up that application. So it looks at all the components and dependencies. In the traditional third party landscape, the way to think about this is when you're assessing a vendor, you consume a service from that vendor, but that vendor relies on several third, fourth, fifth, nth parties to deliver a service. That's no different than software. What makes up a commercial software package largely isn't built by your software vendor. The large majority of it is open source or third party components. So just like you need to oversee how your vendor does due diligence over its third parties, you need to determine what's in the software that you purchased and are all those components, those third, fourth, fifth, nth party components which make up that package, safe and can you rely on them? Are they coming from a trusted source? Are they still maintained and supported? So there's a lot of nuances about
Mm,
software that you need to understand before just letting it into your business.
got it. So just to check my understanding here, what we have here is large sized files which people are buying. Obviously, when you buy a piece of software, you have to download it or whatever. That's coming in a very, very large file size, which your traditional antivirus protection can't cope with. It just
Mhm.
and so it basically just waves it along past, and then obviously deploys. And therefore, if there's um, something you don't want in there, some malware or something like that, that's just going to go straight through and get deployed into your environment. So that's
That,
unless
that's
you.
that's that's absolutely correct. And there's a couple other nuances here, right? Software development vendors have no shortage of application security tools at their fingertips, right? They have, if you think about the AppSec land space, they have static application security testing, SAS. They have dynamic application security testing, DAS. They have SCA, software composition analysis. All of these things require access to the source code, which they have, right? Because they're the publisher of software. That's their intellectual property. As a buyer of software, that would be far too invasive, right? A publisher of software is never going to give you access to their code base. So you are largely limited on the buyer side of what you can do because all you have is that software package that you're
Mhm.
about to deploy in your environment. So the other part of this is thinking about like, if I'm a buyer of software, what options do I have to test the software before I deploy it? And to your point before, like it's probably too late. If you've already bought and purchased that software and deployed it in your environment, if it has risks in it, you're already going to be susceptible to those risks. You don't want to catch those risks before they're already materializing in your network. And this goes back to that Gartner point where the large majority of organizations don't find risks until after they're deployed. The way we position our technology in the business context is you need to test the software either before you procure it so that you can have an open and honest conversation with the vendor and protect yourself contractually through
Mhm.
some either clauses to say you either need to fix these critical issues that we found before we deploy it. No different than any other third party assessment, right? You perform a third party assessment, you find a security issue in the vendor environment. If it's critical, you say, look, we're not going to buy your product until you fix this or have an action plan.
Mhm.
The same thing's true for software, or you ask for a discount on that software. So you leverage your intelligence and knowledge to gain some business value.
Mhm.
So You want to do that ahead of time, pre-deployment, to ensure that you don't lose this contractual leverage, that you've already bought the product, you're using it, the business is at risk, you kind of have your hands tied as a buyer.
Yeah, absolutely. So how do we? So I sort of we understand the limitations now of traditional means. What's the alternative? How can people think about getting that visibility, that as you say, exploding the package and actually looking at it inside? How do you get to that before you actually have your hand, before you buy the software?
Yeah, there's a mix of options, right? A lot of organizations, a lot of software vendors that want to drum up business will make the software package available to you ahead of time during like a proof of value, a proof of concept. So you haven't bought the solution yet, you're just trialing it out. Some organizations will publicly post the packages on their websites for you to download and trial. Think about like you want to go try a new photo editing software. You can download that for a free trial and test it. You're using the package, so you have access to it. Smaller organizations will require you to interact with your sales team, get access to the package. But from all the organizations that we've worked with, it's very rare that you actually can't get access to the
Okay.
software package ahead of time. Most organizations will allow you to try before you buy.
Okay. So if we can get try before you buy, how does an organization undertake that level of assessment? Is this you know, importing it into another package? Is this an approach? And does this come hand in hand with the due diligence piece? So should we be asking different questions alongside doing this sort of testing as well?
Yeah, well, I think the good news about binary analysis itself is that you can shed a dependency on the supplier, right?
Mhm.
So if you have the package, you can test it yourself. You can inform yourself of the risks that are presented by that package, and then you can make business decisions based on that. So do you have compensating controls in place? Do you have um, can you work with the vendor to actually fix the issues? So the good news is all you need is the package to test it. You can upload it to a solution like ours or another solution and evaluate it without the need to interact with the vendor.
So you could literally go to their website, I'm interested in
Download it,
that,
test it,
without even
and
talking to them.
correct, which is extremely powerful. Once again, now I don't advise that, right? The The most successful third-party security programs that I've ever been a part of are very collaborative relationships with the vendor, right? There's a very strong relationship between buyer and vendor. They're informing each other proactively about the risks of doing business with one another, and they're maturing themselves over time using shared
Mhm.
intelligence. This should not, just like a third-party risk assessment, in my opinion, should not be a gotcha style exercise. This should not be either, right? It shouldn't be, I tested your software, you found all these issues, you're bad, I'm not going to buy your software, right? It should be used in the vein of collaboration
Mhm.
and uplifting of security maturity and security posture to keep yourself safe and protect yourself from future threats moving forward. So, in my opinion, yes, it's very powerful because you can do it yourself and you can inform yourself proactively. But it should be done in collaboration with the vendor. So not only you don't only know about the risks, but you actually work with your vendor to address those risks. And once again, provide yourself some contractual protection against those risks before they materialize and you're kind of chasing your tail.
Excellent. So help me sort of visualize what we're talking about here. So we talked about the concept of this technology exploding the package to actually look at it in, but what does that look like in real life? Is this, we take the package, we download it from the supplier's website, or they send it to us, or take the trial version, whatever we're talking about. We put it into this new technology. What do we get back? I mean, do you get back? In my rather weird head, I'm almost thinking like this is like an X-ray machine. It sort of goes through, and it's got the dodgy bits go red, and the safe bits go green. You know, what is the output from this to the buying company?
Yeah, no, it's I love that analogy of the X-ray. That's actually really good because at the end of the day, all people want to know is, can I trust this software or
Yeah.
can I not? So the ultimate outcome of our personal reports are pass and fail, and that's predicated on some risk appetite that you configure. But in its simplest terms, what we do is deconstruct the package. So we take out, once again, all the components and dependencies that exist within that software package that you procured or that you're considering procuring. If you think about like a Russian nesting doll, you're
Mhm.
just recursively unpacking that package until you get to the smallest of parts. And what you can do is build what is called a bill of materials, a software bill of materials. It's also referred to as an S-BOM.
Mhm.
So it's just an artifact that categorically lists everything that's within that package. Now, that only takes you so far, right? Uh, Sometimes we hear this analogy of a bill of materials. It's like an ingredients list of food that you buy, like a cereal box, for example. But that doesn't tell you that much, right? It just tells you what's in the software, what's in the food, not whether it presents risk to you as a consumer, right? I can look at all the ingredients on a box of cereal and know what's in it, but wouldn't it be more helpful to understand, have any of those ingredients been maliciously tainted in the supply chain and had things like, I don't know, some poison put in it? Have they been recalled for some
Mhm.
reason because they've been tainted? Has it expired and it's going to cause me material risk? The same concept is true for software, right? I know what's in the software. Does it present a risk to my business? So what we do is we layer intelligence on top of the deconstruction to say, okay, now we know what's in our software. Are any of those components known to be malicious? Are any of them associated with known vulnerabilities?
Mhm.
Are there artifacts in that package beyond just the components, like text files, for example, which contain secrets like sensitive information, plain text credentials, which may make it easier for an attacker to compromise. So we look at a holistic set of risks and threats associated with all those parts of that software and layer it with intelligence to tell you whether it's risky to your business. So the ultimate outcome is a basic report, which one says, can I trust it or can I not trust it? If I can't trust it, here are all the risks and reasons beyond my risk appetite that I said I can't trust it. Maybe it's a critical severity vulnerability. Maybe it's a known malware implantation. Maybe it's a piece of sensitive information that I absolutely cannot have in my production environment.
The way that you've been talking about that in terms of exploding it and then looking at the components, and then overlaying the intelligence, it's effectively doing what we're trying to do with suppliers in terms of unlocking the fourth parties, doing that due diligence, but within the software product itself, isn't it? This isn't even, um, looking at an IT provider or a SaaS provider and going, right, well, you're providing the product and it's sitting on an AWS platform or Microsoft. You're actually looking inside the product itself to say,
Mhm.
what components are there and where do they come from?
Correct. And this fourth party part is really interesting. I was trying to think about this and draw parallels once again between the TPRM landscape, software being one of those types. And it's really interesting if you think about fourth parties in the traditional sense. Well, software, I mentioned this previously, is largely made up of third-party components. So Synopsys, another application security provider, does a really interesting report every year called it's like the OSRA or report. I think it stands for Open Source State of the Open Source Security Program or something like that. Well, anyway, they had this finding that essentially says 96%, so almost the entirety of modern software packages contained at least one open source component, and more importantly, 76%, so more than three quarters of the average modern application is open source. Um, so even within commercial software that you are buying from a third-party vendor, we see this heavy reliance on open source that's developed by some third-party, external party,
Mm.
ultimately being bundled into these commercial products. And the specifically difficult thing about open source maintainers that are external to your vendor organization is that they don't have the same regulatory obligations. They don't have the same market incentives that enterprises building and selling software have. So the publisher can't govern them. You, as the buyer, definitely can't govern them. So this topic of fourth, fifth, nth party risk is only amplified in the software supply chain when compared to the traditional supply chain.
So if we look at this, we used the analogy earlier of Microsoft Word that you were downloading on your laptop. One would like to assume that, you buy a Microsoft product, huge organization, as you say, they've got all sorts of tools and capabilities at their fingertips. You know, whilst we would never be naive to go, anything we buy from them is safe, we won't do anything. Is there a view that actually this sort of technique can be focused maybe on less established organizations primarily? So, maybe it's because we had a separate podcast talking about how to work with startups. And, when you're trying to tap into the innovation that's coming out of those smaller companies to get that market edge, it seems to me that this approach with those less established companies would be even more important because they may be the ones bringing together lots of different technologies that pose more of a risk. So can it be used in that sort of targeted way as well?
Oh, okay. So a couple thoughts there. I won't speak poorly about Microsoft, right? Microsoft does a great job. We value their products. They're used almost everywhere. So this is not a Microsoft problem. But any piece of software that we found throughout testing tons of commercial and open source software has its issues, right? So I don't think you're going to find more issues in a starting in a new startup that's doing cutting edge, innovative things. We may talk about that later with AI and the risks that introduce, or like a very well established behemoth of a software vendor. They're both going to have issues. It's just how you deal with them and how you make progress in addressing them. Now, I 100% agree that there is some validity in that this approach may be more effective with medium to smaller size software vendors as an enterprise buyer, because once again, you will have more contractual leverage with
Mhm.
them to enforce them or work with them to address any issues that you identify. Doing third party assessments for a very large financial service entity, what I found was that you tend to get much more dynamic, collaborative individuals that are willing to work with you in any possible way at these smaller vendors,
Yeah.
because your business may make up 50, 60% of their ARR, their annual recurring revenue. And so that relationship means a lot to them.
Mm.
And so they're willing to work with you, waive contractual audit rights, or help ensure that remediation timelines are smaller. Where if you go to a behemoth software vendor and say, like, look, I tested your software, I found these issues. Can we work with you to fix them, or can we share intelligence with you about where they exist? They may be like, yeah, send it to us, but we're not going to respond to you. Like,
Yeah.
we have 10,000 other enterprises that we sell this product to, versus a smaller vendor may have
Mhm.
20, right?
And
And so
and
that
those smaller
relationship
vendors,
means more to them.
absolutely, and those smaller vendors are still on that growth curve. They want to improve, they want to learn. They're the ones who really appreciate and respond well to that collaborative approach to TPRM that you mentioned earlier, because
Mhm.
they want to evolve their company into one that is more acceptable and more attractive for future business. So, yeah, I can definitely see that. Um, you talked earlier. You just mentioned the wonderful phrase AI there.
Mhm.
That's always a fun topic. Obviously, from a TPRM perspective, we see AI as both a potential benefit in terms of some of the technology that we're looking to bring in, and we had a previous podcast around that with the use of AI in sort of due diligence assessments and things like that. But obviously, we're also looking at AI as a risk, and I think a lot of the organizations are trying to play catch up on that. How does AI play in this space? What does, can this be used on AI platforms, AI software? What's your take on that?
100%, absolutely. And this is actually really timely. We have a dedicated threat research team at Reversing Labs that are amazing. They do some really cool research. I'd encourage you to go all read their technical blogs if you're interested in this topic specifically. But they just recently released a blog about a new attack that they identified, a new attack technique in machine learning models posted on a software development platform for sharing AI models called Hugging Face, and a accompanying white paper to go along with it. But one of the key takeaways of the research in general, is that it's kind of a mind shift, but AI is the supply chain when you have to think about it, right? AI is the developer that is writing our code. AI is the underlying model that is embedded in our software that we rely on to run our businesses and lives more
Mm.
generally. AI is the attacker, right? It's being weaponized by malicious actors to launch attacks against us in a more systematic and streamlined manner. Honestly, it's a fascinating topic. I could talk about it for hours. For the purposes of brevity, I'll pick one of those that I think is probably most relevant to the TPRM community, which is that developer piece.
Mhm.
So AI is developer, right? Your software vendors are leveraging AI powered coding assistants or agents to enhance productivity and write code that goes into the products you consume every day.
Mhm.
No surprise, right? I think everyone would largely expect that.
Yeah.
Clearly see the benefit that's derived in AI from development, right? Accelerated time to delivery. Maybe if you're a buyer, that means you get products or features quicker that you asked for, or maybe at a lower cost. Fingers crossed, but probably not. Um, and this isn't this esoteric state, right? This is happening right now. So the CEO of Google came out and said at the end of, I think it was last year, that AI systems already generate about 25% of the code that Google creates.
Wow.
So every business on this planet is in some way or another consuming software that's AI generated. To your point, what we don't consider is that these machine learning models that these virtual assistants leverage to generate code are trained on historical data sets, some that date 15 to 20 years back. And the code being used in development is also going to be old that
Mm.
it's being trained on, right? And so it's susceptible to the threats of 2 decades ago. So maybe it's including old third party components and libraries, to our point before, that are vulnerable. Maybe it's reintroducing cryptographic algorithms in that software that you're concerned about your data being protected that have already been deprecated. Maybe it's using open source components that aren't maintained anymore and have
Mhm.
no more support. So it's because these agents lack kind of experience, context, human awareness that's needed to discern between uh, good quality, high quality code that's new and old code that is susceptible to old attacks. So, in other words, you're taking two steps forward and one giant leap
Got it.
back, right? You're gaining incredible efficiencies in AI to support the development and speed of that development, which is great for the manufacturer. But tying this back to the TPRM audience, for buyers and TPRM professionals that are responsible for protecting the enterprise, it's a huge risk because they're simultaneously eroding your security posture by introducing these new mistakes that are known.
Mm.
So imagine this shiny new tool that you bought as a either as a business that the business is asking for or a TPRM tool that was just released to market this year, but has Heartbleed, WannaCry, Log4j embedded within it because that's what the AI agent served to the developer that isn't aware of those. So that's the risk here that we're trying to mitigate. AI is a great business accelerator, but it also is certainly a new attack vector that malicious actors are actively preying on.
Got it. So it's in effect, what it's allowing companies to do is deliver old code very quickly rather than new code.
Correct. Yes, it's delivering code quickly, but because they're trained on historical data sets,
Mhm.
it's trained using old code, which is susceptible to old risks.
So the static binary approach that you've been talking about, again, here would take that packet that has been produced by these AI technology.
Mhm.
You would take it, you would have a look at it, you would explode it, and then you would identify that actually it's got these old templates, these old products, or these old vulnerabilities in them as part of that. So in effect, you're taking that snapshot after that delivery point from the AI techniques and being able to identify where that has happened. Is that correct?
Correct. There's no difference in approach, right? The software developer just used it to develop that package. That package then gets compiled and shipped to you as a consumer.
Hmm.
So you as a consumer are just testing the software as you would before, using static binary analysis, taking it, deconstructing it. The hypothesis is when you deconstruct it, the components and dependencies, once again, in that S-BOM that make up that package, you will see that they are old. There's this concept in software called like file rot, where there's all these files and components and dependencies that have built up over time that are no longer supported, and they're just like 10, 15, 20 years old. Sometimes when we were doing a proof of value for a customer in the UK, actually, and they tested a vendor package and they found a vulnerability that was like 20 years old. And so that's the risk that we're bumping up into, right? Is you find these like legacy components that have been used for years and years and years because they're valuable, but they also may not be maintained anymore, and or maybe older versions of components that were once um, normal, but are now susceptible to threats that haven't been updated.
Got it. Got it. Um, there's a lot of focus on cybersecurity through a lot of the new regulations as well, which is causing or supporting organizations in um, uh, sort of upskilling and looking at this in more detail. And, things like DORA, NIS2, et cetera, that are coming out. What's your view on that regulation? Is that going to be driving more focus in this sort of area, or is this sort of catching up with where we are already? What do you think the impact of the regulation is going to be?
Yeah, well, it's interesting having moved from. We were talking about this before. I just moved recently from London to California. I'd been in London for 6 years now, and I'm back stateside in the U.S. officially. U.S. is a very different regulatory market, right? There's this trend of deregulation in the U.S. that's being kind of pushed by the Trump administration. We're seeing the opposite in Europe, to your point. And that puts kind of like global organizations in a really interesting position, because if you want like a global footprint, you need to meet the strictest of requirements. So we're seeing one of the themes we're seeing in regulations, to your point, is this kind of keen focus not only on supply chain security, but software supply chain security more specifically. So you mentioned NIS2 has this general focus on the need to uplift supply chain security for critical services and infrastructure in the EU. We're seeing a very similar trend in the UK through this cybersecurity and resilience bill that was announced recently in the King's Speech that will come into effect, similarly affecting critical infrastructure in the UK. You have some that are very narrowly focused on software manufacturers. So the Cyber Resilience Act in the EU essentially says that software manufacturers need to ensure their software is safe, free from critical vulnerabilities or known attacks before they publish it to the market. And if it's not, they have to go through a number of conformity assessments, which is great. But if it's not, the regulator can actually pull that software from the market. So that will be a huge improvement to software quality in the EU. But you also have completely differing views. So from the European supervisory authorities, the ESAs that oversee the financial service sector in Europe, they came out with DORA, to your point, which broadly covers financial service entities, but it has a different point of view. So it essentially says the opposite of the CRA. I don't care if you're a publisher of software. If you as a financial service entity use software to provide a service to your customers, you are responsible for ensuring it's secure, so ensuring those ICT vendors, the products that you consume, are secure. And you're responsible for responding to any vulnerabilities, threats, or attacks that materialize in that software.
Mhm.
So I think we're at this inflection point with a lot of these regulations just coming into force. DORA went live January 17th. Immediate compliance is required. You have the CRA that came into force last year with a bit longer lead time for those obligations on software manufacturers to start taking force. But regulations definitely moving in the right direction, in my opinion,
Mhm.
of these increased expectations and obligations, not only for the publisher of software, but also the buyer of software in the TPRM landscape is very much still on the hook for demonstrating those kind of best practices and
Mhm.
supply chain security.
Fair enough. Okay. So it sounds like the answer to all our prayers and cyber and the ability to get rid of all of our cyber questionnaires is static binary analysis if we go down that route. Although, as you said before, I think there's the days of being able to move away from our sort of questionnaires and some due diligence approach is still some way off. Um, is it just is it okay simple? Have you seen situations where people have used this sort of approach um, incorrectly? Are there sort of any lessons learned out there in terms of people looking at this things not to do? I guess.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that comes to mind is like I said, S-bombs are a very hot topic right now. It's becoming a standard audit artifact that's getting more and more attention. So I explained what S-bombs are before. Um, it's really not a topic that should be new to anyone because there's several, once again, cross-industry, regional, legal, regulatory, mandatory standards like the CRA I had mentioned before, like PCI DSS, NIST, that require S-bomb generation in some capacity. And as a result, we're starting to see it's become commonplace and actually being demanded by buyers as a part of the procurement process. Maybe buyers are building it into contracts to say every new version of software you publish, you need to give me an S-bomb. Um, I think the mistake is relying on your vendors to provide that S-bomb, right? People still very much see it as a obligation of the software vendor. We talked about that before with the Cyber Resilience Act, right? Like there's regulation coming out that software vendors need to do more to protect the software that I consume as a consumer. Like the consumer should be protected. We've kind of debunked that theory with all these other regulations like DORA that say, no, 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 you are responsible. That does not, even the Critical Third Party Act in the UK, this new regime that we talked about previously, specifically states that yes, critical third parties are more responsible for uplifting their best practices, but that does not um, take any obligation off the buyer to still do some due diligence over them. But anyway, going back to the S-bomb, um, despite it being demanded in contracts and being integrated into contracts, the maturity in generating S-bombs by software manufacturers is still very low. So we work with let's call them a Fortune 100 financial service organization. They were running a pilot with their software vendors that they were essentially going through this process of like, we want to be more mature in the software supply chain. Great. Let's go and ask our vendors to provide an S-bomb for all the software that we consume from them. We'll write it into our kind of standard contract template. We won't enforce it yet, but we want to start collecting it. So they ran a pilot over 10, 20 software vendors. And the results essentially fell into three kind of categories or buckets. A very small portion, 1 to 2, said, yes, it is our obligation as a manufacturer to give this to you because we produce this software. We want to make sure it's secure. We'll generate this and share this with you. Great. Another small portion, 1 to 2, said, yes, we know about an S-bomb. We know we need to do this, but we're not ready to do it. We're not in a mature enough state yet. The large majority, including some very high-profile software manufacturers, essentially said, no, we don't feel like it's our right to provide it to you. We feel like this is a violation of our IP or privacy rights, and so we're not going to give it to you. We don't trust you sharing this information with you. For even the ones they did receive, they were received in inconsistent data formats like a voice recording or a piece of paper that was shown over Zoom. For the ones that they did receive, they noticed that there was intentional suppression of components and dependencies that have known vulnerabilities, for example. So they were hiding them. And others were out of date. So they were on old versions of software that they weren't even using anymore. And this is someone with very strong contractual leverage, but yet the majority of their vendors are unable or unwilling to provide. And so I was, once again, thinking about this, like if you compare this to a traditional third-party risk assessment and what we're used to doing as third-party risk professionals and questionnaires, imagine if you were going on site to perform an assessment and one of the standard checks, at least I always did, was background checks. So for scopes in systems in scope, which we share sensitive data and it's stored, access process stored in that system, we may ask for a population of employees that have access to that system you select a random sample, and then you ask them to provide background checks for those samples that you selected. Imagine if you asked for that evidence and they either were providing you voice recordings saying, "Oh yeah, these samples you picked, they were fine. There was no convictions on those." Or even worse, if they provided the background checks, but redacted or knowingly suppressed known instances of fraud that were picked up in those background checks. Like that would be a complete, absolute, that would absolutely kill a relationship, in my opinion. You would likely terminate the vendor right there, and you wouldn't resign them or do business with them. So why are we letting software publishers off the hook for not being able to provide this audit artifact that is contractually written
Mm.
into obligation? So the one thing we've learned from all of this is that you can't, this is not an audit. The industry is not at a place right now where you can rely on your vendor to provide this type of information. So the trend we're seeing once again is buyers taking this into their own hands and saying, I'm not going to rely on you to provide this. I'm just going to generate it myself. So despite best efforts, I would say, asking software vendors to provide audit evidence and true assurance artifacts like an S-BOM hasn't worked, has failed in a huge way. So wherever possible, equip yourself with the ability to perform that due diligence yourself.
And I guess the other piece as well is it's all very well getting an S-BOM from a supplier if they can provide it, but you've then got to consume it. You've then got to do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where the intelligence overlay that you were talking about before comes into it, because, effectively you just get given a list of products, a list of components, and you look at it and you go, okay, is that good? Is that bad? Whereas, with the intelligence overlay that you're talking about, you add that in, and that allows you to get to that pass fail mark. It allows you to bring in those vulnerabilities. And one also assumes is once you've got that information, you can tie that back into your horizon scanning vulnerabilities and things like that. So, if a move it happens in 6 months, you've then got a record of all of the software applications that have got that as a component in there. I mean, that might be a bad example. I'm not that technical, but that idea that if something comes up along the line, then you can take it into account.
Yes. That is absolutely one of the use cases we hear a lot, is building a catalog. So using the S-BOMs that you receive from a software vendor or that you generate yourself in a perfect world, to build a catalog of components and dependencies that you rely on, right? You are gaining visibility into your software supply chain. That becomes very powerful when you're trying to do proactive assurance, like you said before. So the next Log4j comes up, right? You don't want to be in a position where your management team comes to you and says, which of our vendors use Log4j? And you're like, I don't know. Let me go ask them over email. Let's be real. In a crisis scenario like Log4j, your vendor is never going to get on a phone with you and respond immediately because they're trying to do triage themselves. This catalog approach becomes very valuable because then you can do a targeted response and query this catalog you've created. Where does Log4j exist across all of the components and dependencies that I consume in my software supply chain?
Mm-hmm.
That way you can very quickly understand blast radius and then do targeted response to those vendors. And you can say, hey, I can see you're using this version of Log4j, which is vulnerable to Log4Shell, which is the vulnerability of a component Log4j. And it exists in these specific components. Can you help me fix them, essentially? So it's once again, it goes back to this like collaborative approach between you and the vendor, where you are almost turning your intelligence inside out against your supply chain and proactively working with and consulting with your vendors to keep yourself and them safe.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about it on previous conversations that, my view is you have the proactive risk assessment, vulnerability identification piece of work around TPRM, but actually, I think that by far the biggest value of TPRM is as a huge database, and actually knowing who we deal with, who we send data to, where the components are from, the fourth parties, who's using what. So when something does happen, which it always will do, we can react quickly and sensibly and minimize any impact in there. Um,
Yeah.
so if somebody wanted to start looking at this approach, how do you start? Do you start small? What are the sort of first 2 or 3 steps that you would recommend people take a look at?
Well, yeah, first I'd understand, we talked about it before, but just like think about you setting up a brand new third-party risk program. What would you do? You'd catalog the third parties that you work with. You'd create a risk
Mhm.
register. Same thing with software, right? You should have visibility into the commercial software that you consume. Once you understand what software you consume, very similar to a third-party regime, what would you do next, right? I have this catalog of third parties, this register of third parties. Which one of these third parties is most risky to my business, right? And TPRM, that's a risk segmentation model, a risk stratification model, where you think about what are the characteristics about a third party which make it risky to my organization. We talked about some of them before. Do I share data with a third party? Do I provide them connectivity into my network? How do they impact my operational effectiveness of my business? If they were no longer able to provide a service, what is the RTO to my business, RPO, whatever? The same thought process can be applied to software, but using different characteristics. Because once again, this goes back to my original point. Every supplier type is different. Software vendors provide a very unique risk that you need to consider. So, does the software require administrative rights to operate? Is it deployed on a single server, or is it deployed across 10,000 laptops in my environment? Um, does the software sits at a external point in my network, or is it connected to one of my crown jewel systems,
Mhm.
right? Thinking about all of these characteristics which make software risky, and then focusing on the software that would have the highest impact on your business if some sort of disruption attack happened. It's once again, it's no different. You shouldn't think about this process as any different than your supply chain risk management or your third party risk management program. Software vendors are a part of your third party
Mm.
ecosystem, your supply chain ecosystem. You just need to think about what you're consuming and what makes software risky, and then integrate that into your third party oversight program. So, what software am I using? What's specifically risky? Focus on my top critical software, begin getting access, work with the business to get access to that software and begin testing. And then as you get comfortable over time, you can expand that. You can do different levels of due diligence, different levels of frequency of testing. Same thing of how you would scale a normal TPRM program.
Excellent. Charlie, thank you so much for that. It's really, really interesting. I think this just shows how the whole concept of third-party risk is evolving, the complexities that we're looking at, the ability to be more tailored to the product or service type that we're bringing in. And there are solutions out there. There are new ideas out there that can start to be applied to this. So thank you very much for taking the time to come on today. Really do appreciate it. And I'm sure many people will be interested in following up on this and learning more. So thank you very much indeed.
Thanks for having me, Mike. Feel free to reach out, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd be more than glad to continue the conversation.
Thank you, Charlie. Thank you for listening to Third Party Therapy. If you like that, why not click on the like button below and subscribe so you get updates in the future, and head over to thirdpartytherapy.com and sign up to our mailing list. Thank you very much.